All right, everybody. So today, back on the podcast, we have Dr. Eric Helms and Steve Hall. How we doing, guys?
Can't
Good to
complain,
be
my
here.
brother.
You guys are a fun one to coordinate because we've got some very different, very different time zones here. So I think the days of me doing like four or more people are mostly behind me, unless everybody just happens to be in the same spot.
Yeah, Steve and I always struggle. It's either he's got to chuck on the blue light blockers, or I've got
I'm in
to
X-Men.
yeah yeah exactly Cyclops over here, or
Yeah.
and or I either have to get up early or we flip it and he's got to get up early. I've got to stay up late. So
Right,
yeah.
right. We made it work. Eric, I saw recently, I don't know which podcast this was, but you were talking about the high volume that you've been doing and how you've been seeing progress. It might have been you guys actually talking together. And you said something along the lines that was very disappointing to me, which is that you said your calves are just where they are. And you've basically given up hope that they're going to change. So one, what's that about? Two, I don't know if
Mm.
you're aware of some new research on this, but it seems like if you completely stop training your calves, that might allocate more muscle to your upper body. So that's how I'm interpreting it, at least.
Yeah. So two things. One, the calves did make progress from the high volume training I did and the stretching protocol I did. And right now we're just going, cool. Let's just hold on to that and put our efforts. It's not like I'm not training them hard still. It's just there's only so many hours in a day, and I have to do a lot of volume to progress. So right now I would say they are on maintenance while I'm emphasizing most other body parts, but not
Gotcha.
all. So
Okay.
that's one thing to put forth. Yeah, the second one is a pretty cool study that recently came out, covered it in Mass, and we talked about it on Mass office hours. I would say that this is very important to understand that it's preliminary data. So it was a secondary analysis of a study on training frequency. Um, and what they did is pretty cool, is they used an AI-assisted full body MRI to look at not only the muscle groups that were trained, but also the muscle groups that were not trained in the lower body in a group of individuals who were doing leg extensions and leg curls. The reason why that's relevant is that most of the time, I would say like 90% of hypertrophy studies that are out there is us using ultrasound at specific sites, and we've pre-selected the sites because we're training those muscle groups and we want to see whether their response to training. And if you read the limitations section of a good paper, they'll say, hey, like if we measured at 60% of the distance of the femur, we're not sure if the growth was homogeneous. Also, we didn't measure the vastus medialis, the lateralis. That could have been different, yada, yada, yada. Um, MRI is great because you can get a lot of data, but MRI is also incredibly tedious to actually analyze. So the use of full body MRI with an AI assisted, much more time efficient way of looking at the muscle volume enables like new insights that we haven't had. One of them is this study where we can essentially look at I say we, like I am science, but I
Mhm.
didn't do this. We don't have MRI. I did. This is another research group entirely. This research group was able to look at muscles that they considered secondary in the leg extension, leg curl, primary, and then not trained. And a really interesting thing occurred where there was actually significant atrophy in the soleus, which importantly doesn't cross the knee. So it's probably you wouldn't expect it to be involved as a even a stabilizer for knee extension or knee flexion. And the adductor magnus, which you also wouldn't expect to be involved. And those are also arguably the two biggest muscles that were probably untrained. They actually significantly atrophied in this study. That's relevant because this is a study on untrained individuals. So you would not anticipate necessarily that anything would change except for growth in the muscles that were trained because they were kind of at quote unquote baseline. Um, and then that in and of itself, a little bit interesting. The the piece that makes it even more interesting is there were significant correlations that were inverse between protein intake and energy intake. So the higher someone's energy intake, the less likely and less atrophy or no atrophy at all that occur. Meaning that in the people who consume the lowest energy and the lowest protein, they were more likely to see that decrease in their soleus and their adductor magnus, and just in generally, like the amount of atrophy compared to the amount of hypertrophy. And there's a cool graph where it shows all the different muscle groups, which ones grew, which ones didn't, and then which ones were actually significantly decreasing. And there's another graph that shows individual participants and how some people had no atrophy anywhere, and other people had almost an offset completely of the hypertrophy with atrophy elsewhere in muscles that weren't trained. So this is what I would describe as preliminary evidence of like a different kind of body recomposition of,
Right.
like amino acid reallocation when there is not enough supplied through the diet. The quote unquote untrained muscle, the biggest ones with the largest quote unquote reservoir, or more likely just where it's easier to measure changes because a smaller change in a larger muscle group is going to be a larger net amount. So you can actually detect it. There could be some reallocation going on. Big caveat though, first study, secondary analysis is something else. So it wasn't necessarily powered to detect this research question. And then the third big caveat is that it wasn't like they did a month of let's just chuck these people in the MRI while they're untrained just to see the normal amount of variation in these muscles. We don't know the kind of the normal plasticity or variation in what appears to be transient atrophy hypertrophy, which may or may not actually be true tissue change, could be hydration or whatever in untrained individuals just over time. So I think it is really interesting, but we probably shouldn't be making sweeping conclusions about specialization cycles, training at a deficit, et cetera, quite yet.
I remember someone theorizing years ago that, and there was not really any evidence for this. They just kind of thought, well, you don't ever see it, which is to say that they thought nobody could maximize their upper body size if they didn't train their lower body at all. They just thought, the body just, it would be too out of alignment basically to do that. And I don't know if there's really any evidence for that. If anything, this would be evidence against that. Again, I understand very preliminary. Would you conjecture anything about that, one way or the other?
This is where it's always see this is my personal bias. That basically what I'm going to say is this is why it's better to be me than someone else, which is, what everyone thinks. But this is where the siloing of being in like the hypertrophy community or the bodybuilding community or the powerlifting community or the weightlifting community kind of can make you make silly conclusions or like not paying attention to history. Sometimes people get up their own ass or they're only focused on the immediate. Most bench press only records are higher than the bench press three lift records. And Paralympic powerlifters, they're doing all right, And
Yeah.
not only in some cases are they not training their legs, they're in a wheelchair.
Right.
So obviously strength and hypertrophy are not the same thing. They're pretty closely linked in my opinion. But yeah, I don't think so. Like that doesn't
Yeah. I don't either, but
it,
it was just, yeah.
it doesn't check out to me. And I think another way to look at it is from a like an evolutionary biology lens. This is something that if you talk to anthropologists, they view everything as all of our adaptations are here today because they needed to be for the species to survive, or they were sufficient at least for us to pass on our genes. And sometimes exercise scientists forget that and they get caught up in mechanisms and kind of just like don't even think about that. Like one example, when we had the hormone hypothesis still in favor, where we think, oh yeah, like circulating levels of growth hormone and testosterone are really doing an important thing for muscle growth. There was the hypothesis that, hey, like if you do legs first and then arms,
Right.
bro, your arms are probably going to grow because of that big growth hormone spike. That was subsequently disproven. But if you think about that from like an evolutionary biology realm, like if you run 400 meters, your growth hormone is really high, and then all of a sudden, like you're fuck, I'm growing, and then like the hunter gatherers are all dying because their body's like, well, I've this growth hormone's around, so I've got to make every muscle like that is moved after this
Right.
sprint grow, even though you're not eating anything. So
Right.
what we actually see from an evolutionary biology lens is that everything to get humans to where they are today is based upon cost saving, right? So if we compare us to our closest living ape ancestors, or like if we compare us to the other great apes, we have like 60% more lower body muscle mass and less upper body muscle mass. We have far less type 2 fibers. We have far more type 1 fibers. We have a higher baseline body fat. Like chimpanzee males are running around at like 3.5% body fat all the time. And they have these really explosively powerful, strong muscles. And they like climb through trees. And that's because they forage in a very tight area. They get food in a much smaller space versus us running around the entire African savanna when we first evolved. Also, apes have much more complex digestive tracts. That's why they're able to extract protein. And because they eat a massive amount of plants and then are able to get nutrients out of it. We don't. To grow our big ass brains, we shrunk our gastrointestinal tract, which then required us to go be out in a much larger place, forage more types of foods, have to get a greater variety of our diet, which also required us to think more. So it's kind of this chicken or egg thing. But the point being, before I go off on an anthropology lesson that's completely unnecessary and waste all of our time, and Steve's like, I got to go to bed, all of our adaptations generally make sense from a survival of the species standpoint. And when you're off on a kind of a tangent, like, oh, maybe growth hormone's going to make my delts grow for no reason. It's like, would that really be something that would help us survive? Not that you should just therefore logic your way through things. We still need to empirically test it. But some of those things really don't hold up when you think about it from that perspective.
Yeah, the Special Olympics and the bench press only competitions are good because to me, just the idea of you don't see that in general is obviously flawed in that most people who are going to work so hard to maximize anything are not just going to say, well, but I don't care about this entire half of my body at all, right? That's very rare.
Yeah.
So you're just not going to generally see that. Um,
Also, last one.
yes,
How big are men's physique competitors these days? Like some of those guys are rivaling the open division in the upper body. Like they're trying to get as big as they freaking can without
yeah,
getting a gut. And they often have chicken legs
yeah.
too, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So Steve, that was just kind of like a random thing. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
No, it's really interesting. The thing I find it all very interesting. It's like, what can we practically take from it? That's where I always come at these things with, especially with science. Like I put practitioner head on. Is like, where does that take me with my clients? Where does that take me with my practice? Specialization was the first place I was kind of thinking. But like you said, we can't draw too much from just one study right now. So it's more than anything kind of interesting. It also makes me think of, because of the discussion just now, if bodybuilders are making their muscles so big, are we draw like this is the dumb bodybuilders? We're drawing like reserves from our brain now, aren't we?
right.
This is the problem.
Worth it.
I
We
think
got doctors who are
honestly,
bodybuilders,
right.
professional as well.
I
That's why
think
we're always
the
pencil neck geeks who are too small, because it's our pecs are stealing our brains.
right. The evidence that's come out in, I don't even know, last maybe 5 years, or I should say, not even come out, the evidence that has been emphasized more recently on how performance enhancing drugs can potentially detract from cognition and whatnot. I think that is possibly one of the scariest side effects thinking about them. You just think about it as that, obviously I work with patients who are up to 100 years old, and to see the decline with age is just very stark. And to think accelerating that, it's just like, oh man, no, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
I'm dumb enough.
Yeah. It's a positive side effect of being a natural bodybuilder is we
Yeah,
only stay as dumb as we currently are.
right. So obviously you guys are very advanced at this point. I was wondering in terms of, because I know Steve, obviously we work together and the amount of volume that you guys do, are you still tracking everything in like an app? Are you writing it down? Because I like at this point, I certainly don't need to. I do because I just like to be able to look up data from the past and compare like, oh, this month versus this. But I know what I'm doing when I go in there and I remember what the last session was because there aren't huge changes week to week. Are you guys still meticulously writing down things logbook wise, or is it just kind of like, hey, let's see how it feels today?
So I'm still using the spreadsheet, so I still have it all tracked in there, and I actually log everything. So all my loads for every muscle group or everything that I'm training with that within that session and all my reps. And I do look back at that like last session to infer what should I do for my next. And in fact, I'll even look back on previous sessions to be like, don't know, is there anything I wrote down there? Sometimes I'll leave myself notes like, hey, Steve, calm down on your progression here, or you need to tighten up technique here because I don't know, there's so many sessions and I forget things. My brain's only so big and my memory's only so long. So it's useful to have it there, I find. And yeah, I think part of it's habit though as well. There are some things that I guess you could argue, do you really need to be logging it? Is log booking absolutely essential for muscle mass growth and things like this? Definitely not, of course, to kind of maximize it, to make the most out of kind of your cutting phase and make sure that I'm not doing anything silly in the gym. I find it useful there. So yeah, I'm still logging
Okay.
everything in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, I track everything in Boostcamp as I'm training, and then I actually do the extra unnecessary work of putting into a spreadsheet afterwards. Um, and the main reason I would say, some of it is habit because I've done that forever, but there's definitely a purpose. Based upon the session and how I'm feeling, whether I'm feeling joint discomfort, where my motivation levels are, a bunch of other things, I'm trying to see if and when I can do more than I previously have. Not necessarily more than the last week or more than the last workout, etc. That's definitely in my calculus, but I will often go, all right, I'm training in the 8 to 15 rep range. So what load am I going to select? And, once I can do a certain load for 15 reps, I'll go up whatever. I have kind of an auto-regulated progression
Mhm.
model. I will look through my records. Like, okay, what's the most I've done for 12 on this exercise? Do I think I could beat that? What's the most I've done for 10? What's the most I can do for 11? And if I feel, some days I get a sense that I'm not that strong, but I have good strength endurance and vice versa, which could be totally in my head, but it seems to be a thing. Um, so I will select what I think I can do. And sometimes I'll go, all right, let's try to go heavy on my top set. And if it goes well, then it's not a top set. I'll just stay at it. If it goes poorly, then I'll drop down to something and try to hit a rep PR. So I'm basically trying to encourage progression by checking my past logs. That's one of the main reasons I do it. Um, and yeah, then I also will look for primarily more when I'm training for strength and hypertrophy. I'll look for inferences in the data is like, okay, when was my estimated 1RM highest and after what time point and what did I do?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I would say I actually almost feel uncomfortable not tracking. Like if I'm on vacation, I'm just looking for fun, then that's one thing. But I still routinely will pull up, like I'll just kind of title them by year and I'll just reference like what did I do this time or that time. And it's sometimes it is telling, like you'll kind of forget that this was done or what was my body weight at that time and how does that compare? So I do enjoy that. Briefly, you mentioned Boost Camp, Eric. What is
hmm
your involvement with Boost Camp?
I'm an advisor on Boostcamp.
Okay.
So for the app, like how do we make the tracking better? Michael Liu, the guy behind it, great guy. He actually way back in the day was a 3DMJ client,
Oh,
and
okay.
he reached out to me and asked if I could help. And he has he's committed to like creating something that's useful for the community. And I'll connect him with coaches and program creators who I think are doing good work and suggest that.
Well, I
Connect him with
need
other
you
people who
to
give him insights.
apologize to Michael for me, and I'll publicly apologize here. So he reached out to me and he wanted to set up a call. And I was like, sure, I've heard enough people doing boot camp, I'll check it out. And I scheduled it like 10, 15 minutes after I typically see patients, which was a bad idea. And of course I went over, with some emergencies. And then I rescheduled to the next week and I scheduled a half an hour from when I last see patients. And of
Mhm.
course, again, more emergencies and whatnot. And I'm like very punctual and I
I
never flake
know.
on anything. So I apologize, Mike, if you're listening to this and you can pass that along. So he might have just completely banned me from Boost Camp and maybe I will not get that third try. But sometimes the patients, it's unpredictable at times.
Well, our last call mostly consisted of me convincing him to not hire hitmen and use the profits from Boost Camp for more productive things. So, A, you're welcome. B, I'm sure he'll forgive you in all seriousness. So,
Yeah, yeah. Um, cool. So you are, Steve, you are 12 weeks out right now from
Yeah,
competing.
well done. 12 weeks
Okay.
out. Well, yeah, basically.
Okay. And I see the body weight is creeping pretty low, right? I think last time I saw was 178.8, which was a week ago, right?
Yeah, that was probably a little bit of an oddity because I had a wild night in A&E on the Sunday, which meant that everything was just thrown off a little bit. So I'm probably just dipping below the 180s. I think I've only seen two weigh-ins below 180, but Cliff only has me taking Monday weigh-ins. So I'm still that routine individual that weighs in every day. So I know how many
Okay.
weigh-ins I'm getting, but he only wants the Monday weigh-in. So that's all he's getting. I,
Really?
however, know where the rest of my weigh-ins are.
He's not into the weekly averages then?
No, I asked him about this, and he said they didn't allow him to be aggressive enough with his changes to get people in shape for stage. So I'm just like, okay. And for me, the biggest thing is I don't want to subconsciously do anything on Sunday to impact that Monday weigh-in, and obviously it's subconscious, so I don't know if I'm doing it, but I'm
Say again,
hoping I don't.
what's his reasoning?
So he doesn't make aggressive enough changes to people's nutrition or like energy intake or output to get them stage ready. So he's just found that
Hmm,
by having the Monday weigh-in, it makes him more aggressive, I guess.
interesting. Okay. And Eric, you're not planning on competing until probably next year, right? In 2025.
Plan is next year at the
Okay.
moment, with me reserving the right to do an more extended off season. But things are going better than I anticipated, so I think I might do 2025.
Okay. So Steve, your last competition was 2 years ago, three?
Yeah, 2021.
Okay. So, and that was when you kind of had that pretty stark comparison, right? Because the before that was a while as well.
Yeah, so I was meant to do 2020, but things got in the way that year. So
Yeah.
anyway, I ended up having a bit more time in my hands, and
Okay.
the year that I competed before that was 2017. So I had a good amount of time between those, and that's where I gained a legitimate 10 pounds of stage weight, you could say, because I mean there was
Yeah. Yeah.
not all of my stage weight were as heavy as that one, but at least one time I was at least 10 pounds above some of the others. I was like a
Yeah.
5 pound range of stage weight. So yeah,
Yeah. No, those were very impressive comparison pictures. So,
When
you
was your
guys,
first season, Steve?
2014.
Yeah, because 2017, I remember thinking, yo, this guy massively improved on his first season.
Oh,
So
I appreciate that.
you've made some pretty impressive changes each time you've stepped on stage, which is pretty cool to see, in my
and
opinion.
when in 2014, you were already what, 7 years into lifting?
Yeah.
Okay. So, wait, that was so you're going to be seven.
Wait.
Wait, I
So
can't.
I have never been very good at. So I talk about the number of years I've been lifting because I actually got into the gym when I was not quite 16. But because of my accident and that setback, I kind of like, do I want to say after that accident, that was my kind of
Right, 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 right.
starting lifting career, or do I want to say at like 15 years old? And I mean, my accident it was when I was 20. So
Okay.
I had been training for basically 5 years up until the accident. And then I competed when I was 24. So that
Okay.
could have been, you could have say that was like 8 or 9 years when I first stepped on stage.
Yeah. So you're 34 now, right? So you're going to be competing for
Yeah.
10 years.
Yes.
Wow.
So it's quite exciting to be. Well, hopefully something good this season happens, and I can be like, yeah, it was a decade of competing, and like, look what you can achieve. But
Can
let's see what
you
happens.
tell at this point if there's going to be really substantial changes from the 2021 showing?
It's really interesting because I'm getting more comments than ever that people are like, "Oh, you've really improved over these like last few years," and
Hmm.
I'm like, I don't know, I'm my own worst enemy in some ways. I'm like, I don't know if I really have improved that much. Like, if I've gained a kilo of stage weight, that'd be amazing.
Yeah.
But I think people think it's, I don't know, kilos of additional muscle over the
Right,
last
right,
few
right.
years. I'm just like, maybe my camera is better, I'm documenting things better, or
Sure.
I think every step above average, you just look, or like average in our eyes, you just look that much better. It's like exponential improvements in the look.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly because I've never quite had the glutes in properly from the rear. Maybe there's like a good 2 to 5 pounds that needed to come off again.
Hmm.
So if I can do that without sacrificing kind of upper body fullness, well, any other fullness in the rest of my physique and muscle tissue, hopefully I can do that with Cliff this year, and my
Is
stage
this
weight
your
may
first
even
time
be just
working
the
with
same.
Cliff?
Yeah.
Okay. So possibly like the advanced natural bodybuilder concept, same weight, a little leaner, right? A little striation compared to last time kind of thing. You guys are
Yeah.
both choosing to stay. Well, you've always stayed pretty lean, Steve, but I I think this year you had pushed it a little heavier and you decided that you didn't like that, right? You pushed like above 200.
That was actually before 2021. I got to like
Huh.
205, but to get to 200 and beyond was unbelievably uncomfortable to the point of which I look back and I'm like, that was like worse. It's worse than the last weeks of prep. Like I could perform in the gym okay, but I felt awful the majority of the day. Like my sleep was not good. I wasn't feeling great at all. Digestion was terrible to the point of which I actually went to the doctors to start getting some tests done to see if there was something wrong. As soon as I started dieting, everything improved. And so I've just found if I stay in a leaner band, I don't run into those issues and I can still hit PRs and I can perform well in the gym. And in my eyes, that's like the match that lights the fire for muscle gain. If I can do that without having to push to that kind of position in terms of body fat, but also well-being, why would I go there? So
Yeah.
this
I
time I
could have
didn't even
sworn
push.
that you
I didn't
pushed
even
up
hit
heavier.
200.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought maybe we were talking about a past time, but I know in general, you maintain, you're pretty lean throughout the year. And then Eric, you previously had gone up to 220, and then now you're saying basically sub 200. So you've both kind of come to the same conclusion that at least at this point, you do not really see a point in going above, I don't know if it's mid-teens, but for you, much heavier. Do you still stand by believing that, hey, for a early, intermediate, even, certainly a beginner, that they should be kind of pushing up to higher body fats, or have you kind of decided, hey, I just don't think anybody needs to do that?
I think body fat's a consequence, not a goal, when you're bulking, personally. So, like, if we understand theoretically what's going on here, um, there's very clear data and also tons of anecdotal experience that you push a big surplus when you're a novice and you train hard, you can put on a rapid amount of muscle mass. And sometimes you don't even like you're gaining a ton of weight and you don't even actually experience much of a change in body fat. So I think the potential for growth for a novice is so high that people kind of just paint with a broad brushstroke and go just eat everything, bro. You're going to gain so much muscle anyway. Who cares if your body fat gets up? And I think that creates this correlation that we anticipate of, yeah, like, yeah, he put on some body fat, but he also got huge. Like he gained 40 pounds of weight and 20 pounds of it was muscle. Couldn't have done that any other way. I think many times the same thing would have occurred if they gained 30 pounds of weight, they would have still gained 20 pounds of muscle. Um, I think essentially the only thing you don't want is your body fat to be so low that it is uh, limiting something physiologically, like if you're trying to hang below your lower intervention point. Um, and that's something that's really just kind of individual. So um, ultimately, you want to have a surplus that's scaled to your potential to gain weight, which is a bit of a guess, or rather to gain muscle, excuse me, at the rate you can. And that will produce a certain amount of, weight gain. And then also there's a certain level of uncertainty and there's a certain level of realism that has to be applied, especially with advanced lifters. Like if we think I'm going to gain a kilo of stage weight at most in a 2 year period, how do you chop that up over time? So then okay, I'm going to have some kind of reasonable surplus size where I can actually observe scale weight changes over some time, a reasonable time frame, which is inevitably going to outpace the rate of muscle gain you can have. So then you end up having these cyclical periods where you cut. Um, or if that doesn't mix with someone's personality, they do something else. But either way, you can see success, and then you have these anecdotes that shake out. But I think a lot of the times it's easier to notice body fat gain associated with the muscle gain once you cut down or just looking bigger rather than just thinking about it from an energy dynamic standpoint because it's not like you living in a metabolic ward and we have DEXAs that we're checking into all the time. So I don't think there's any necessarily benefit of gaining body fat. It's just something that happens when you're in a surplus, and you probably want to be in a surplus in many of the cases we're talking about.
Do you think you would be more or less where you are today, physique-wise, if you had never allowed yourself to go over, let's say, 195 to 200 pounds?
Um, Probably pretty similar. The thing is I'm like my where I'm probably going to go now is going to be a little bit over 200 pounds.
Okay.
because I'm looking more muscular than I anticipated at like right now, this morning I woke up at I was like 198 point something.
Hmm.
And I'm like I still have quad separation. It's kind of weird. So I suspect that I will get up into the low 200s before we decide the mini cut later this year. Um, Now I think just to go all the way back to when I was a novice and when I first started lifting, I went from like 170 to 190, 195 without much of a visible change in my body fat percentage. And then I put on probably another 10 pounds of muscle on top of that in the next, geez, uh, decade plus.
Yeah.
So, I think I needed to get to 220 to do that? Probably not. That's what I've kind of force fed myself up to. But yeah, I think if I had just at the point where I started to see things slow down naturally, if I had just kind of encouraged a slow rate of weight gain, and at the same time point I was at 220, I was instead at say 210, I think I would have a very similar level of lean mass with 10 pounds of less body fat.
Yeah.
So,
When you've talked a couple of times about how well this gain phase is going and how, you got quad separation at 198. Well, I would assume, obviously, we're not assuming that at the same body weight, you've got, 5+ pounds more muscle, right? I mean, I think, if you were to compete next time and gain 2 pounds, that would be pretty incredible, like on stage. So does it seem to you like it's more than that? Like when you're looking at 198 now, is it like, wow, this is a completely different physique to normal people? Or is it just like in your eyes as a natural professional bodybuilder, you're seeing noticeable differences?
probably somewhere between the two. I
Yeah.
like the if anyone's followed my log, like the first four episodes were basically me struggling with reality because it was more muscle gain than I was anticipating.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, it's hard to remember back. I've been lifting for 20 years, but I remember when in 2007, in 2005 when I first started lifting, excuse me. No, 2004. Jesus. Um, I was thinking that every pound I gained on the scale was muscle, and I
Mhm.
wasn't that far off, for a while. It's just my mentality. It didn't seem weird to me. It was what I expected. I was reading Flex magazine. Everything I was following was IFBB Pro Bodybuilders. I was a new lifter, and it's what it looked like too. So this is absolutely not that. Like putting on 20 pounds of muscle and having the same exact body composition it's mind blowing, right? Like I actually don't even think necessarily if I jumped on gear would I experience that now.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
maybe if I took enough, but like the rapid gains that someone can make as an early stage novice are just wild, and I think we forget that as well-trained lifters sometimes.
Sure.
Especially even as bodybuilding coaches, because it's rare that I can't say I've ever worked with anyone since I stopped being a personal trainer who it was their first time lifting weights when they started working with me. So I just
Right.
don't see it, you know. Um, but I have worked with a lot of people who shift to a far more optimal approach to gaining muscle, and they never properly finish their novice gain, and you see like, whoa, what's going on? And I'm not the most extreme of those examples right now, but I would say so. Right now, I'll put it in pounds. I'm 198 pounds. At this body composition, I expected to be more like 194, 193, somewhere in there if I'm
Yeah.
converting the kilos. So like it visually to me looks like I have 6 pounds more of muscle. Um, Whether that will actually shake out, whether that's fullness, whether it's in the right spots, whether I'm just a little bit leaner at this level of muscularity than I'm used to. I don't know. So we'll see.
And I think you said
Maybe I'm
before you feel like that's because previously you had kind of divided up the training between like powerlifting, bodybuilding, weightlifting, and you think some of these changes are because you were just full bore into bodybuilding now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing more volume, more sets closer to failure, tailored exercise selection to bodybuilding, and I'm not splitting my this like basically everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Everything I'm doing right now is optimized towards gaining muscle, and I'm doing a lot, man. So like it's a level of work at a level of intensity that I simply could not do when I was also training for strength sport.
Right. And Steve, I mean, you've always been bodybuilding, right? I don't think maybe at one point you had like a short period focusing on strength, but I mean, really no powerlifting, no strongman, anything like that. So, for you, it's kind of been that focus this whole time. So I think that will be really interesting to see. Like Eric is technically, in terms of years, more advanced, but I think you maybe have had a longer period purely dedicated to bodybuilding.
Yeah, I have done some powerlifting meets, but they were in like 2015. I think, I did one powerlifting meet in 2015 and I did a little bit of like just power building. So I never went specifically powerlifting. And then I suffered an injury and I decided I was just like, I'm just going to all in bodybuilding. So yeah, from about 2016, it's been
Yeah.
pure bodybuilding. And there was like, I flirted with powerlifting for like half a year or something. So yeah, pretty much solely focused on that. And I can say it's really interesting hearing about the way that Eric put it in terms of like your size of surplus should be relative to your muscle gain potential, and also thinking about kind of allowing your body weight to go up, but the body fat is more of just a I think of it as like a cost of doing business. It's not like a goal to get that body fat. It's just like it just comes along for the ride because some people might think, oh, Stephen, that between 2017 to 2021, when I gained that large amount of muscle mass, more than I'd gained between my previous kind of off season, it was largely because I allowed my weight to go up, but wasn't because I went to 200 plus. It was because previously I'd capped myself at like 180 pounds, 185. So I was working within this range of probably right below or around my intervention point, like lower end intervention point, because this is when P ratios were kind of hot on the press. And I was thinking,
Yeah.
hey, this aligns with me wanting to stay lean and I feel pretty good here, but also better muscle gains because I'm going to partition more of this surplus towards muscle versus fat. And yeah, we kind of know well that that's not the case now. So I ended up having way greater muscle gain potential and I fed it through my nutrition from 2017 to 2021 because my training also was way more like purely bodybuilding, much more focused. This is when I was paying more attention to technique and those sort of variables. So, and volume was also coming more to the forefront, and I was pushing more of that. And I do think I've continued to refine and get better. But yeah, so don't know. Just wanted to add that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. With the amount of volume you were doing, Eric, I know you mentioned you're doing a decent number of drop sets and rest pause sets. I've done rest pause for years. I mean, my one at home workout is all rest pause. It's just obviously for efficiency and whatnot. But and Steve, you don't really do any of that, right? You're mostly straight sets across the board.
Mostly, yeah.
And I recall seeing at least one, if this was not a few papers, talking about how, when they measured straight sets versus rest pause versus drop sets, more or less, there were no statistical significant differences there. And it's interesting to me because in theory, like we have these studies that say, hey, lower rest times are less effective, right? If you're not kind of for volume and whatnot, if you had 1 minute rest versus maybe 3 minutes rest, it seems like that's not as effective. And then I know like Zordos has talked about what that allows you to do more volume in a session and whatnot. You also then see some that say, hey, rest pause and drop sets were just as effective, which to me sounds a little bit counterintuitive because a rest pause is effectively a really short rest time. So how do you kind of square that circle?
Well, a couple things is if you look at some of the most recent analyses, like there's a preprint looking at rest times, the differences between shorter and longer rests, if you account for volume and if you're training to failure, they are much smaller than we previously anticipated. And the amount of rest you might need in those cases where you're getting equivalent hypertrophy, maybe as little as like 1 to 2 minutes. That said, the data all leans in favor a little bit of having longer rest periods. So a
Just
huge
to
issue we
clarify
have.
real quick, sorry, but just
Yep,
to clarify, on accounting for volume, the shorter rest group would inherently have to do more sets, right?
correct.
So, which I always just wonder, like, okay, so even if they were exactly the same, why would you want to do more sets with less rest to get the same results?
You wouldn't. It's a mechanistic understanding of what's going on here, right? It helps us understand why are short rest intervals poor, right? So if you rest too short, but you account for the volume, you get to the same place, then we understand that the acute fatigue from the shorter rest period is probably part of the issue of why you wouldn't want to rest too short of a time period. So that's it's more of a study design way of trying to assess the mechanism by which there's a difference between, rather than a practical application of rest
That
periods.
totally makes sense to me. It's just I know I've definitely heard Zordos on Mass say this, but I'm fairly sure others as well talk about how, well, you might want to do this, or it allows you, like if you're going to do, let's say, shorter rest, you need to do more sets or whatnot. I guess maybe if the rest time was short enough, you could finish the workout faster. I mean, if it was like really significantly shorter, I guess that would be like the one application possibly.
So the application would just be it's an optimization problem, right? So if you rest 3 minutes versus 1 minute, but you only have to do one more set to
Yeah.
account for the lost time, are you saving time? Depends on what your cardiovascular, shape is and how many sets you're doing, but there is probably some sweet spot where
Yeah.
essentially you're optimizing the amount of effective work done, right? Um, that's the concept, but how that actually plays out is probably going to differ a lot between exercise selection, rep range, proximity to failure, and individual cardiorespiratory demand.
Yeah.
Um, so looking at the data on rest intervals, there is a general leaning in favor of longer rest intervals being better. And I think this is something I've talked about a good bit, but um, fatigue is like this kind of quote unquote thing that we talk about as coaches and athletes that I would always like people to be more specific as to what they mean when they mean fatigue, because if we're talking about ultimately what's task failure can occur for a lot of different reasons. You know, task failure on a calf raise versus task failure on a squat in different rep ranges can be caused by two different, very, very different things. And the perception of discomfort that may make you terminate a set or may mask itself as muscular failure can be quite different. So one of the issues with short rest intervals is it's just essentially meaning that you're turning this into a cardiovascular demand on top of muscular failure, right? You're never resting, so you're constantly moving. So now you're doing cardio while lifting. Now you have a potential fatigue that is not related to the muscle, and you can see inhibitions in your ability to produce the same proximity to failure. So essentially, the rest interval stuff needs to be considered in that context. And a lot of the rest pause and drop set work that shows equivalent outcomes to straight sets, although typically it's a few more drops or a few more rest pauses, but you can get to the same place, especially if it's time matched, maybe even further with some of these techniques. They're using isolation movements or only upper body movements. And a lot of the rest interval data that seems to favor longer rest periods, it's looking at kind of more holistic types of training programs. So I think the way to view it is that you want to be sufficiently recovered and choose the right exercises, rep range, and exercise selections if you're going to use, say, an antagonist paired set or a rest pause set or a drop set that doesn't result in a ton of cardiorespiratory demand or discomfort, which could mask itself um, as failure when it actually is not. So the way in practice which I use this and which I program for athletes is big compound lifts, especially for the lower body. Generally, we're not going to be using any of these time-saving techniques. Um, and other exercises potentially are candidates for it. But we don't want to accelerate cardiorespiratory demand and general fatigue. What we're trying to get to is local fatigue and then getting enough work. So some things that probably aren't a good idea is drop sets that are only getting you a couple reps, unless you plan to do a whole lot of them, kind of like, your rest pause or myo reps type of approach. Um, so when we look at the data on rest pause and we look at the data on drop sets, those drops and those rest pauses are still getting a fair number of reps, right? And we're getting to some type of equivalent volume to what we would be doing with straight sets. So that's kind of basically the endpoint we want to work backwards from is we care about the total amount of work done, and we care about the level of muscular tension that is being developed in achieving it. So if you're seeing these massive drops off in load, its perceived discomfort's higher, You're getting a whole lot less reps. It just feels hard, but the RIR is questionable, but you're getting the same amount of quote unquote like work done. Is that work as effective? Probably not. So it comes down to finding a way to save time without sacrificing the actual tension stimulus you're, for the most part, you're providing to the muscle.
Am I remembering incorrectly that I had thought that the groups were not matched for volume, that they were matched for sets? I mean, obviously there's more than one study out there, but I thought it would be comparing like, hey, barbell curl, 3 sets of 12 with 100 pounds versus like the rest pause, it might be like 14 and then 6 and 4 or something like that. Um, in that example, would you expect the latter over time to see less progress?
I think you might, it depends on the study we're talking about, but I think you might be misremembering. Some of them will compare 3 straight sets to, like, for example, the drop set study that I'm thinking of. The 3 straight sets is just 80%, 80%, 80% of 1RM. And then the drop sets went like 80%, 65%, 40%. Like they did more total drops.
Okay.
So when loosely, if we were to guess, if you're going to try to compare, say, drop sets to straight sets, the concept is you probably want to do another 20, 25% more drops if you're going to count them each one as a set to get to the same number of straight sets.
Okay.
So yeah, if you were just to do 80% 3 sets to failure versus 80% immediately to 60%, immediately to 40% to failure, you might get better outcomes with the former example. Maybe. I don't know if that's been experimentally tested. I have to actually pull it up in front of me instead of just shooting from the hip.
Yeah, but
But yeah.
presumably you guys are, or you're doing this because you have to do so much volume and you're not trying to work out for 4 hours. So you are adding some of these techniques.
Yeah, for me, I'm in pretty good cardiorespiratory shape. And I also like here's like some people are like, oh, I think you're actually hurting your performance. And I'm like, I can measure my performance. I know if it is, then I don't do it, right?
Yeah.
So like for example, one thing that I don't advise many people do unless they've tried it and they notice equivalent performance to doing it as straight sets. I do antagonist paired sets on the leg press and leg curl.
Mhm.
And the leg press I do is very, very quad dominant. And I don't notice any difference. Like I have logbooks of when I just do them separately,
Really?
or just I go to the gym and someone's on the leg curl. Like, all right, I guess I'm not doing antagonist paired sets today. It's going to take longer. I don't have any difference between doing it that
Are
way.
you going directly, like you finish your leg press and then within 20 seconds you're leg curling?
So I go to the leg press, I do it, I walk across the room, I sit down on the leg curl, I set it up. If I've caught my breath, which maybe takes another 10 to 20 seconds, then I go. So there's
Wow.
potentially a minute between the two, I
Yeah.
would say. And then I will rest after the leg curl, and then once I catch my breath, I do the leg press again.
Right, right.
Important thing is I'm not timing my rest intervals, but I am going when I feel ready again. So for example, my leg workout yesterday, I did 4 sets of RDLs on their own. And then I did leg press and calf raise on the leg press. And then I did leg extension, leg curl back to back with antagonist paired sets. And then I did a rest pause on hip thrusts on the leg extension, when you adjust it on the pad and you turned it into a hip thrust thing.
Yeah.
And I got through, that was 5 sets on calf raises, 4 sets on everything else. And the rest pause was one initial set and then 3 rest pause sets. And I got through that in an hour and 5 minutes. So that, if you compare it to my log of when I have taken an hour and a half to get through that same workout, just because I went at a busy time in the gym and I'm not a dick and I'm not taking up all the equipment, the performance is identical in terms of how much
Interesting.
actual work and reps and stuff I did. And if it's not, I don't do that because
Right, right.
I'm very results oriented. So yeah.
That is interesting. Yeah, I mean, I love antagonistic supersets. I do an upper lower split, so basically everything I do is antagonistic supersets.
Mhm.
Um, Not that this really matters at all, but I would be curious if you were to do a leg curl fresh and then you were to compare a fresh leg press with a fresh leg curl, that superset, if it would make a little bit more of a difference, only in that, and I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but like for me, it's like the first set or the first exercise of a muscle group to the second, I was like, okay, I'm clearly weaker. And then like for a while, it's at that weakened, kind of generally fatigued state, if that makes sense. Like the subsequent drop off after the first couple of hard sets of a muscle group are not as great. Like I could do a second chest exercise, or I could put that as a third or even fourth chest exercise. It's not as substantial. I don't know if you've noticed that or if that makes sense, but it just kind of curious.
Dave, I tell you what, um, there are some wild inter-individual differences in fatigue, set to set, exercise to exercise, and throughout a workout that I've seen.
What do you mean by
Um,
fatigue, Eric? I'm just kidding.
exactly, right? So, no. So in let's say interset performance drop-offs after doing the same amount of reps on the same exercise to the same proximity to failure. So I can speak to this from anecdotal or research perspectives. I'll start real quick with the research perspective. One of the things I did for my PhD was we had a setup where we auto-regulated volume. You start with a given load and you do a certain number of reps till 8 RPE or 2 RIR. Then you drop a certain percentage of that load and then you keep doing sets in that same format with that reduced load until you get back to the original RPE. So let's say 8 reps at 8 RPE with a 5% load drop, and then keep going until you get back to an 8 RPE. There are some people that got there in 2 sets. There are some people who got there in 12, and then we had to operationally say no more than 8 so that the study is feasible in pilot testing.
Hmm.
So that is a 6-fold difference, in that example. Anecdotal fun experience here. So I have a training partner, my colleague, Dr. Matt Cross. Um, he's a lifter. He's also a cyclist, so he's probably has a very different training background to me. When we do drop sets on arm work, he's about 90% as strong as me. I drop 2 plates so that I can get enough reps. If he drops 2 plates on each of his drops, his reps are going up.
Hmm.
So he might get 10 on the first. He drops 2 plates, he'll get 12. He drops 2 plates, he gets 15. Drops 2 plates, he gets 40. And he's like, I'm doing cardio now, right? Um, if I drop one, if I drop 1 plate, I will get like 4 reps on each one, and I'm just like I'm too fatigued. But if I drop 2 plates, then I can maintain roughly the same rep count, even though I'm on those 4 drops. I'm eventually getting down to like 50% of my starting load. So completely different fatigue patterns, even though a relative similar strength, same exercise, and we're both
Yeah.
training to failure.
Yep.
Another really, really fun difference between us. So, this is also true. We had one of my PhD students. He's a competitive bodybuilder. His name's Takahiro Itagaki. We're doing chest supported rows, and at the end of the set of chest supported rows, we do scapular shrugs. Okay. I finish my set of 10 rows, and I can get equivalent number of reps on shrugs, like 10 more shrugs after I've hit failure. And they're almost at failure. Like I could have maybe done one more rep than the number of actual rows I did. Matt gets about 50%, and then Taka can get 2. So the limiting factor in the exercise for me is clearly not my scapular retractors. They're more fatigued in Matt, and they're completely fatigued for Taka.
That
I
is
noticed
interesting.
it.
Yeah.
And I have the biggest arms out of all 3 of them, and Taka has the smallest arms. So like you can start to see like, okay, what's going on here? So there's a lot of factors involved there. There's going to be individual physiological differences in your cardiorespiratory fatigue, your lactate clearance rates, your buffering capacity, your fiber distribution, and then there's going to be biomechanical differences in which muscles are dominant more in a given
Right.
compound exercise. So it's it's messy stuff.
Yeah. I would guess, Steve, that I mean, this is mostly based on one, the fact that you stay so lean, you have a previous history as a cardiovascular athlete, that you do not see as much of a drop off set to set. Is that accurate?
It kind of depends on the muscle group to some extent. It's actually funny, Eric was talking about his antagonistic supersets, and I was thinking about leg press. And I see some people even myo-repping leg press, for example. So they get like proximal to failure, rest up at the top, and they go again. And you're also mentioning doing leg press and then into calf raises. And if I do a set of leg press, my quads are so pumped and disrupted in that sense. I have to like just rest. I can't do anything else. If I tried to do something else, it would just be uncomfortable. The
Mm.
limiting factor would be the discomfort in my quad. So yeah, I see it's a bit varied, but not wildly. Yeah, not huge drop offs. I tend to find the higher rep lifts drop off more, but it's probably a similar percentage as the lower reps. So I don't kind of worry too much about that. But also, Eric, do you see that? Do you both see this where on those higher rep lifts, you might see an initial big drop off, but then it kind of plateaus where it's like
That's what I was kind
smaller
of getting
drops.
at
But
before.
then the
Yeah.
percent is also simply dropping off as well. So it kind of makes sense in some way.
Yeah, I use the
Yeah.
example of exercise, but I could have also said it with first set and like the reps. It's like there's that fresh state, and then after that, I just kind of generally fatigue, and that second state can maintain for quite a while in my experience.
But one, I
Yeah.
will say, Eric said his arms, and you see quite stark drop offs when you're doing the drop sets there. My arms, like biceps in particular, the performance just plummets. As soon if I do one set that's close to failure, like my biceps like cooked completely, and they are obviously one of my stronger muscle groups.
Yep. I think there's something to be said for how easy is it to disrupt, to challenge, to put an overload through a given muscle group. Um,
Mm.
like that's something where you can actually use this as a useful test. Like if you're trying to do like a higher foot placement, more glute biased leg press, do it and then go jump on like a multi hip or a hip thrust and see like did was there a big drop off, you know? Um, and for me, I don't have as in like incredible of arms as Steve, but if you were to compare early in my career, my arms to say my back, my arms were definitely better. My biceps are a stronger muscle group, and I've had to work very hard to get my back to grow. So like that fatigue pattern I see on rows, like it makes sense from a physique development standpoint. Um, so I think there's a lot of factors at play for sure. But generally, I also noticed that this is from coaching and individually, that when people who train close to failure and they're only losing a few reps or don't have to drop load very much, they tend to do better with more volume. And people who drop right off, they get crushed by a fair amount of volume. And like it's funny, like if you read my PhD, I talk about, you know, when you overshoot the load. Like we had an operational pilot tested based, here's how you adjust when you overshoot an RPE and how you adjust load. So just as a specific example, you're supposed to hit an 8 RPE on this set and you hit a 7, we would increase load 4%. So it's 2% for every 0.5 off the target RPE, and that generally corrects the average person. And then in some of subsequent work at FAU, like Zach Robinson's work, they had a protocol where they actually took one group to failure and they had to increase the amount of reduction to keep them in the right rep range. So they're, decreasing load 4, 6, 8% because they had failure. If I was to have been pilot tested in my own work, I would be not fitting that mold. So for example, if I do bench press for 10 reps and I hit like a 9 or a 9.5 RPE, I can repeat that same load and those same reps. I can't necessarily do that on other exercises, but for a lot of my upper body movements and some of my lower body movements, I can repeat 9, 9.5, 10, and even sorry, not failure. I typically lose a rep if I go to failure, but I don't lose as much as a lot of other people. Like I train with some people, they hit failure on bench for 10 reps. The next set they're going to do 6. And that's not me at all. But maybe that's part of the reason why I seem to do better with higher volume, or at least be able to do higher volume in an acute session.
You mentioned you're pretty cardiovascular fit, I think, or fit in other ways. Are you guys, either of you guys doing much cardio? Again, I know Steve, you used to do a lot, but I don't think either of you guys do much now, right?
The last I did was I think I did a 5K during the 2020 lockdowns. It
I
was like for
remember that.
charity.
Yeah.
I haven't done any. I mean,
Wow.
maybe I
Just
by
step
accident
count,
somewhere.
basically, right?
Just walking the dog out there and some high rep hack squats.
Yeah, mine is I get an average of probably 9,000 steps, which is really not that high. And then my training itself probably keeps me in good shape
Yeah.
because of the way I train. And there's
I,
just put it out there for the research nerds. There are a couple of studies that were done in the mid 2000s, but basically what they did is they started people at 2 minutes rest, and then every week or every couple of weeks they dropped 15 seconds off, and there was non-significant differences in that group compared to a group that just did 2 minutes the whole time. So it basically gave them time to acclimate to shorter rest intervals, and they're coming all the way down to I think 30 seconds between
Non-significant
sets.
differences in hypertrophy.
Yep.
Wow.
So
Even at 30 seconds.
well, again, it wasn't 30 seconds the whole time.
Right, right,
That's
but
kind of
still. Yeah.
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 So it's ultimately like, can you get to a place where like there's a big confounding factor in our understanding of rest intervals of how well adapted are the people to those rest intervals.
Yeah.
And any S&C coach who does resistance training with highly trained endurance athletes knows this. You will like you can watch an endurance athlete do a set to failure on squats, and then like in 30 seconds they're like, so we're to go again. And like you do that to the bodybuilders and they're like throwing up, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of it's also because the endurance athlete is doing body weight and the bodybuilder is doing 2 times body weight. So the
All right.
objective like thermodynamic output is higher, but a lot of it is the recovery too.
Yeah. Yeah. I often think about I need to, not need to, but I just like taking my time with my workouts. And they
Hmm.
honestly take longer than they probably should. Like not counting the warm up, it's probably like an hour and a half for me to do upper body. And I'll do again, these are, I mean, my antagonistic supersets aren't really supersets. They're just back and forth. Like I'll do like
Yeah.
back, wait 3 minutes, chest, wait 3 minutes, etc. So really between the same, I'm getting like 6 or 7 minutes between the same muscle group. So I could for sure shorten my workouts. It's just kind of like a nice time to decompress. But I think I probably should cut it back a little bit at times. And I'm curious how long both of your workouts take, because given the volumes you do and the frequency that you guys do.
So I'm kind of similar to you in that sense that I'd like taking my time, and normally I'm not rushed. I give myself 2 hours typically, like if
Okay.
I have something I need to get ready for afterwards or what have you. But I would say on average like an hour and a half for my sessions, and I follow an upper lower split
Yeah.
like you, Dave. But I don't do the antagonistic supersets generally.
Oh, really? Okay.
My it's also a practical thing in my gym. Equipment's like there's only like one thing of everything, and if it's busy, there's just so I just prefer just I'm not going to be able to get it. Let's just follow
Are
the
you,
session through.
so you're not working out at home at all anymore?
No, I haven't. We moved actually out of that
Oh,
flat to a house, and you'd think the house would be better for a home gym, but it's not because it's London and this is an old Victorian house, and
okay.
probably if I tried to lift in this house anyway, it'd fall apart somehow.
Oh man, because I remember when I worked out with Aaron Straker, and he was saying he never does antagonistic either because the whole issue with getting the equipment. And I would, one, I probably didn't care enough, and I'm like good on gym etiquette, but to some degree, I was like, well, if they're right next to each other, which had happened to work out, I would do it. But now I work out exclusively at home. Now that I actually have a rack down there, 2 racks, and it's been awesome. Like just like wake up and go downstairs to a comfortable basement and just have everything I need. Like I would still obviously like on a vacation or with friends go to the gym, but total game changer for me. And obviously this allows me to do whatever sequence I want.
Yeah, that's nice. It's actually interesting on the rest period part there as well. I was just thinking, Eric kind of indicated that if people have larger rep drop-offs on exercises or in muscle groups, they probably don't have as high a volume tolerance. They probably don't need as much. Whereas someone who can just endure, like Eric's chest maybe needs a bit of a higher volume in your back as well, it sounds like, than your arms. And those muscle groups people might also who have a higher volume tolerance recover quicker so they can get them done a bit sooner. Anyway, it's not adding anything to the discussion apart from just my
I have
thoughts
a
in the
big
background.
drop off on everything and everything's still small. So how do you explain that?
You
This
know,
is my problem with quads. I can't do that much volume through them, but I want them to be huge.
I think there's like the fatigue response and there's actual responsiveness itself, like to stimulus. And I think those can vary and covary in different ways. Um, like there's people who do great and they're incredible when they do a low volume program, and then they're even better when they do a high volume program. And then there's people who And they can handle a ton of work. They're just super resilient. And there's people who can uh, they respond great, and then they do more volume, and they just get beat up. And then there's people who can handle a ton of work, and they're never going to be a good bodybuilder. They're an endurance athlete, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's funny when these people get siloed, like like if you hang out in like the low volume cliques, and especially if they only follow physique sport, like the discussions of like, oh, I don't want to go mow the lawn on Sunday because it might
Yeah.
mess up my leg day on Monday and stuff like that. It's like, have you ever watched CrossFit Games? Like, would that just make your head explode? Like, have you ever watched an actual athlete? Like, no offense, like I love me some Dorian Yates, I love me some old school Mike Menster, but the the fragility mindset of what you can recover from in the gym to me is almost laughable. Like I don't know, man, the stuff that I experimented with and I see like most people experiment with when they haven't been like when they haven't had their minds like too influenced by outsiders is like or like just thinking about like what kids do and shit like that. Like,
Yeah.
it's just yeah. And it doesn't mean that it's necessarily necessary or even beneficial for hypertrophy, the amount of work that you can do, but we would not be here today if you could only handle like 6 sets per week to failure or you die or whatever.
Right.
Like
Right.
some of the narratives are, which is hilarious. But yeah, I think there are a lot of different factors here. Like I, all I know is that I can handle a lot of volume in a given session without a lot of drop off, and that I also don't experience DOMs for that long, and I can train it again. Um, I used to be of the mindset that, oh no, and but whether you should or not, who knows? Like you really have to look at responsiveness. But the more data we get on both proximity to failure and volume, kind of just gives me the impression that hypertrophy training is about getting the most area under the curve of effective work that you can, so long as you're recovering from it. And that's going to vary wildly based upon the factors I just said. But generally, if you can do more at a higher intensity, it's probably going to be better for you long run, so long as you're recovering from it. And that doesn't just need to be looked at within a session or even within a microcycle, but also needs to be looked at within a mesocycle. And I think where most of the errors or the dogma comes from is when people are too focused on some of those individual time points. So like, yeah, and most of the time the logistics are what hold people back, not like some kind of theoretical thing.
Yeah.
So for me, to go back to answering your question, my workouts, if I'm training with a workout partner, they take longer because the amount of time that they would spend, and we're talking a little bit, even
Sure.
though like my workout partners know that it's not necessarily socialization time when we train together. So I haven't had a ton of, workout partners for the years. I'm not that fun to be a workout partner. It's not like, oh, I get to connect with Eric. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, I get to train with Eric, right? So unless I'm on vacation or we're doing a mashup or whatever. So my longest day is day two, where I do a lower body session and then I do a little bit of arms as well. And that takes me an hour and a half with a workout partner, about an hour and 15 on my own.
Okay.
And the important caveat here is that I go to the gym when generally it's dead. Like if anyone goes to commercial gyms, they know in the morning and then after work, it's quite busy. And then it's also busy right around lunch. But if you go between those times, it's actually really shockingly dead most of the time. So I train at like 3 p.m. Because I can, because I have my own schedule. And there's typically 2 to 3 other people in the gym that I go to.
Nice.
So unless they just happen to be doing the same exercise, most of the time I can be locking down two pieces of equipment, and I often do. Another practical piece of advice to people who want to do some of these antagonist paired sets is do one free weight exercise with a machine.
Yep.
That way you can bring the dumbbells over and you're fine.
There was actually just real quick, Eric, I would think no because your history and your interests, but maybe because you've been in research setting. Have you ever done a VO2 max?
I have done a VO2 max test.
Okay. Do you remember what your score was?
No, because it was 2005 or six.
Oh,
It was
okay.
a
So this is a
long
long
time
time ago.
ago. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I've talked on the channel before. I find them to be completely miserable tests, but I do one every few years just to kind of see. But yeah, they're just like the guy who set me up with it, he was like, "Oh, like why do you hate doing them?" And I was like, "What do you mean why? You're I'm pushing
They're
as hard as
awful.
I possibly can cardiovascularly. That's not fun." But yeah, I was just
No.
curious.
I don't think it's that high. I think I am actually primarily more anaerobically well adapted to repeated efforts of near maximal work. Like I don't think like if you made me run a mile right now, I'd be surprised if I could get more than like a 9 minute mile or maybe
Oh, really?
eight something. Yeah.
Mm,
I mean, I haven't ran in a long ass time. So maybe I'm selling myself short, but my best mile ever was in the low sixes.
okay. There was a podcast I think you had with Alberto and maybe Jeff recently, and I think I wrote something down. You said, I don't know if I even like have the quote here, but there was something that you had mentioned with the stretch versus like I think Alberto was talking about how his back had, it was initially very good. And then if anything, it almost was not as good later.
Hmm.
And I had talked to him a little bit about it, and I think he was saying when he was going super heavy, like almost too heavy, that was maybe a good thing. Have you guys, obviously there's all the, the length and partial research and all this that's going on now. Have you guys both found that you do respond more to just that heavy back work, getting a really intense stretch with it, maybe doing some partials at the end? Or do you just kind of view it like, you still want to get perfect range of motion every time and all of that? Because back seems to be, one in particular that people talk about that with. Steve, you
I'll
want
jump
to
in.
go?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think I've been doing I don't actually know how long it's been exclusively length and partials, but back and calves. Calves are the area where I was very convinced early on because hey, they
Yeah.
hadn't been growing for a long time, and there was quite a lot of data coming out on the calves and being stretched. So I was like, hey, I'm going to just go exclusive length and partials for calves. So I've been doing those the longest, but then back just theoretically at least made loads of sense to me. And I found myself, for example, bent over rows have been a staple of my program for the longest time. And I was finding reasons to use momentum and draw like a bit of loose form to kind of get it short because I had to touch my stomach for full range of motion because that's most effective. And so when I kind of thought about it a bit more, I was like, this seems like a bit of a refined way of doing it, just not going short. So I can just milk out this kind of lengthened position where I'm strongest, but it's like easiest within the movement. So it's been probably like 2 years I've done almost exclusively lengthen partials for my back. And it felt so wrong at first because I
Hmm.
was like full team full ROM, of course, and everything. And I've got the vest and the t-shirt. So after a while, though, it just kind of lots of the back movements came to just a natural end at that point of that kind of 90-degree arm bend or kind of pulling up to eye line or what have you. And all these short-term proxies that I tend to like in terms of like pump, local fatigue, disruption to the muscle, that all felt better. And progress has been equally as good. And I've actually found I probably need a little less volume in general when doing it. And so I've actually really enjoyed doing, yeah, the length and partials for the back. So that's all you asked about, right? It was just length and partials on the back. So we'll
Yeah.
see this year. Like I'll get the stage shots and we'll be able to look at my back and see if it looks significantly different. But I think something's happening there.
I'd be York.
It's hard to say. Like one of the things that I have that's not super hard to say. I'm relatively convinced that the emphasis on trying to get more tension at a longer muscle length has helped my physique across the board, and probably more so in my delts and back. But the reason why I say it's hard to say is because, like I said, I've changed more than one thing. It hasn't all been at the exact same time. Like even leading into 2023, I was doing a specialization cycle for my delts and back and calves, but I was also training them with an emphasis on the lengthened position. Not necessarily always lengthened partials. I think there's a lot of ways to do this, and I think um, bodybuilders have talked about cheating and ways to try to enhance the stimulus for a long time. Some of them use that as an excuse. Some of them use that as post hoc rationalization, and others do it actually quite intentionally. And then some did it intentionally, but in a way that we know now is probably not ideal. Like they're cheating because I want to get more of those squeezes on my back. And it's like,
Mhm.
okay, so you're cheating through the important part and then trying to get more of the part that probably doesn't do much. While others have done that in a different way, like really controlled into the stretch and then exploded. So at least on the eccentric, they're getting that lengthened position. But I think the way to view this from a pragmatic perspective is, okay, listen, we know that the longest position of a muscle, if we can supply a high tension, that's a good thing. So however your cheating is going, it's only useful if you can enhance that. If you can get more quote unquote lengthened exposures, as like Cassim might put it, as an example. So I actually really like on back work, just redefining the failure point, and essentially going to the point where you're just till the range of motion decays to almost nothing. Um, as you've probably heard or understood from like that example of me doing the scapular shrugs after rows, my back is often not the limiting point in these exercises. So I can put a tremendous amount of volume and intensity through back work. And I don't like I'm only starting to get sore again for like the first time when I combine all these techniques. Like I'm doing a high volume to failure, and I'm defining failure as the point where I can only get like a 10% of a pull down. And
Mhm.
then I'm like, oh yeah, I can feel that the next day. So I think my experience is relatively unique, and just that it's hard for me to get my back to work. But early on, back in the day, Berto and I trained together and trained very similarly, and we would do like shitty form Yates rows and deadlifts for a large part of our back work. And it was definitely working for Berto, but it was like not working for me. And I think the combination of Berto cleaning up his form and also sustaining in his 2008 contest prep a bit of a sciatic injury, so he couldn't do those things anymore, um, or a back injury that resulted in sciatic pain, I should say. Um, his back did degrade a little bit, and I think it was noticed. And then like it kind of got back, and then further than that, when he used a more targeted, intentional approach of training the back at a longer muscle length. But I think he was managing to get some of that. Like I remember his barbell rows, like it'd be this gross, explosive, like nasty thing, but then he would lengthen it all the way down, and he'd get to that extended position, hold it for a second, and then explode through it. You know,
So you
so
feel it didn't really work for you just because other muscle groups took over too much?
yeah, the limiting factor for me and the thing that seems to get the most stimulus is ne like it's almost never my lats on any movement, to be honest,
Mm.
which sucks, but it is what it is. Like when I would do explosive barbell rows, and I was rowing over 3 plates, rowing, like, at least Yates would count it as a row.
Right.
But like I would get posterior chain soreness from like my lower back down, and like kind of upper back and bicep soreness, maybe some root delts, but just wasn't my lats. I
Interesting.
mean, I'm sure they're. I mean, it's not like they weren't doing anything. That's just not the way bodies work. But they
Right.
were absolutely not the main beneficiary of those movements.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting with the, we talked before about, I mentioned exercises dropping off, and then we were saying like, reps, and then this, scapular example. I will say that my drop off to go to partials is pretty stark. So like I will do a rest pause for a chest supported row, and it might be 17 reps and then, like 10 reps and then 7 reps. But when I finish with partials, I can really only get one or two before it's just like nothing. And I see some people will get half the reps that they just got with
Yeah,
partials, and that's not the case for me at all.
I find it's very movement dependent. Like some like back work is almost always done on machines or cables. Like cables are going to be relatively homogeneous, like a lat pull down or a seated cable row, um, or free weights. So, like if you have people talking about machines, you can get a very different experience depending upon how the machine is constructed.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
free weights, you always have to think about what type of body English they're using, and if it's relatively strict, I think that kind of
Yeah.
lines up in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. This is completely unrelated, but just something I thought about. So, most of us who have dieted to pretty extreme levels, you experience that you go to the bathroom much less frequently, right? I mean, you could be, going from twice a day to once every other day or something like this, right? And yet the volume that you eat often is more at times, right? I mean, if you're like some of us, just like pounding fruits and vegetables to try to get more volume in, to be more full. And this might be a question for Gabriel Fandaro, but like I just think, so where does that go? You're eating just as much. And is the body just becoming more efficient at absorbing more from it? Because it is interesting how you can eat so much. And it's just like, I don't know where it's going.
I so I think that's an important thing about low energy density foods like fruits and vegetables. They look big. Like if you fill up a bowl with broccoli, it looks big. But if you were to puree that broccoli and squeeze out all the water and put it in that bowl, it's a lot less. If
Sure.
you ever like, here's a great example: the whole bag of spinach, right? The whole thing, right? It's like, if you actually wilt that spinach in a pan, you've now got
Sure.
less than a fist. So the main reason why these energy density low foods are useful, they take so long to eat, they take up space and they fill your gut, but they don't, when it comes time to them getting all the way, digested, they actually take up a lot less space than you might anticipate. So yeah,
I'm sure that's
that's
part
that's
of it.
that's part
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah. I
It's like
have any
cooking
thoughts, Steve.
mushrooms.
Yeah.
If you cook mushrooms too long, then they just suddenly go to absolutely nothing. You're like, oh, damn, this is meant to be like a good diet food right now. Or spinach, the same thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Spinach for
It's
sure.
funny. I remember speaking to, I think it was Martin McDonald about this, and he was talking about the digestive efficiency during different phases. And it just made me think of when I get to that near 200 pound mark, my like number two frequency just suddenly kind of skyrockets where I'm like, yeah, yeah, two a day, whatever. And then it's like four, five. And I think I have to then push calories up really high. My body just gets very good at just going, no, like get rid of it. It gets really
Yeah.
efficient at doing that. So, yeah, I don't know, made me think of obviously on the way down, we know we get better at extracting it all. So, on the way up, I think maybe we get less efficient if you're someone like me and don't know, your metabolism wants you to stay slim.
I think I'm almost positive I've read this study. This is like, pulling from my memory a little bit. I believe there was a study that looked at individuals with obesity and those without, and they analyzed how good they were at extracting nutrients from partially digestible foods. And the individuals with obesity were able to actually get more calories, like the short chain fatty acid production, and like if you looked at the efficiency of calorie energy extraction from foods where there's a variability there, it was higher in people with obesity. So I wouldn't be
Interesting.
surprised at all if you max out, like your body is getting very, very good. It's taking longer in your gut because there is more time spent trying to pull every last bit of energy out of it. Um, and then
Traxler just mentioned
there's
in,
less.
or he
Yeah.
referenced at least in one of the recent mass articles about how I forget who he was talking about, but they were basically saying how it was very hard for the body to maintain or to have an intake of more than 2.5 times BMR. And there were numerous reasons for that, but one of which it was theorized that like the body basically just can't long-term absorb that much. Do you know what I'm talking about, Eric?
So it's specifically related to what is the amount of energy expenditure you can maintain over time, and it's 2.5 times your BMR, which also scales with how much you can eat. Because, if you're going to maintain
Right.
weight, then yeah,
Right.
yeah.
There was just like a brief part in there. You're right. It was about energy expenditure, but there was a brief part theorizing that something that like the gut might not absorb as much over time and whatnot. And I would also say this is partly why I think, like in my experience and anybody who's had pretty massive cheat days, it's like you might have 10,000 calories, which think, I haven't done it in a long time, but and then 2 days later I'm the same weight. And I'm like, the math does not math there if you were to have absorbed everything.
Well, the interesting thing is the short term, this is energy expenditure, but like you can absolutely jack up your energy expenditure for short sustained periods, but you just don't observe extended periods where someone can maintain those high of energy outputs. Um, Another thing to consider is that when you go through a short-term overfeeding phase, um, there are a lot of potential deposition sites for that, like glycogen and also fat mass and all those things. So um yeah, like even when you eat like when you eat 10,000 calories and there's going to be there's going to be a large increase in your energy expenditure just from doing that. If we think about
Sure.
the thermic effect of food being 10% of what you eat, right?
Yeah.
Absorption is probably going to go down a little bit, but max out your glycogen and potentially see some fat storage. Like that's not as much as you might anticipate. That's probably we're talking like a pound and a half of body weight gained at most.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I'm definitely not trying to say that you can like completely trick everything and just get away
yeah,
with,
yeah.
an absurd amount. It just like I've done it where it's like, okay, 10,000 one day versus, 5,000 2 days. I mean, you'd have to factor in what the baseline calories were, but you know what I mean? I've matched the surplus and it seemed like when I would have absurd amount, like the most I'd ever done, this was again, not advisable, but I had 18,000 calories in the day in its 24-hour period. And I was a pound lower the next week on the same day of the week. And it wasn't like I, ate 800 calories a day after that. I went back to like 2,000 calories a day. So again, wouldn't advise it, but there's been a few times where I'm like, it was such a big surplus. So
Mm. Yeah,
It reminds me. Oh,
there may be some issues with absorption when you're going that high.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sure your number twos were nasty.
I don't remember to be honest,
they
but
can't have been that bad.
yeah, yeah. I actually had a
Or it's PTSD blanking it out, Steve.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I had a buddy in college who he was like not for somebody who would only been lifting for a few years, he was pretty impressive. And kind of like checked in on him later, and he ended up being on ESPN for competitive eating, Carmen Sincotti. And he was going against whatever the number one guy in the world with a hot dog. Uh,
Kobayashi.
maybe there was somebody else with like a very recognizable name. It was like Joe something. But either way, he was on ESPN. I was like, how did you get into this? It's just but yeah, the amount that they would put down is pretty absurd.
I would love to actually see research on those guys. I think that'd be interesting because some of that doesn't add up. At least it doesn't seem like it does. I don't know what their habitual intakes are. Maybe it's they hate eating outside of competitive eating
I
contexts. I
think
don't
they
know.
eat a lot of this one guy at least we eat a lot of salads and like fibrous things, I think to expand the stomach to get used to stuff like that. So it might not be a crazy amount of calories all the time, but yeah,
Hmm.
it is kind of ridiculous. So this one, and Eric, we don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. I don't actually know if this is like an open thing. I wanted to talk about finasteride. Is this something that you talk
Yeah,
about?
I noticed that there's been discussions about my own personal medical history on your podcast without discussing with that with me, and I was like, "Isn't this guy a dentist? Doesn't he know?" You're like just randomly talking about that
Well,
is
I didn't bring it up to be
appropriate.
clear the first time. I think because I didn't know about it because I had seen a video of you from 10 years ago, and I was like, man, this guy has made some gains. But I mean, you had made some muscular gains, but you had made some hair gains, my friend. And
Mm.
Steve and I have talked about this before, and we have both at this point, I think Steve, like not decided to take it. But I gotta say, your progress pictures, it was impressive stuff. So I'm just curious with somebody who is so like if you're doing it, one, I know you've thought about it and you've thought about the
Yeah,
potential
we got all
consequences
the
and
research
all of
on
it.
it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that, makes me think, okay, so there was, I'm sure, plenty of rational thought. I'm just curious, when and what made you go into that.
Yeah, I just noticed that I was getting like I started getting a receding hairline when I was 19 before I
Mm,
even, started lifting and it started to bother me. I was like I'm just not ready. I don't have that much willingness to be less vain in my late 20s. So I think it was 2017 I started taking yeah, finasteride 1 milligram 3 days per week. So a very, very, very minimal dose
yeah.
and seemed to be pretty effective. Um, yeah, and then all the data is pretty clear on it. Like the side effects are extremely minimal for most people. Um, and there was a comparative study in hypogonadal men taking finasteride, anabolic steroids, finasteride only, anabolic steroids or none, and there weren't any differences while resistance training on terms of body composition. So, yeah, like it was funny. Last time I heard you talk about it on this podcast, you're like, oh, the potential for negative side effects. I'm like, what potential for negative side effects? That's not been shown in any of the data.
Have you not read the
Or
comment section on the YouTube videos?
There's a lot of
you
anecdote.
know, yeah, that's true. If I went by that, I would be doing a lot of things differently.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah,
No,
but yeah,
I
when
know.
you
Well, go ahead.
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Obviously, yes, fairly familiar with the research as well. I do understand that it is, the percentage is low, but they are there. Like, I don't want people to think that that doesn't exist. I mean, it's
No,
what, 3 to 5% people experience sexual side effects. And I always wonder, like, okay, like, if I'm asking my friends, and I have a number of friends who take it, are they going to be honest with me if they've got like ED or something like that, right? The bigger concern for me, because that's something where if you notice it, you could just stop, right? Like you could very clearly tell that's happening. I think for me, it was more like some of the psychological effects that some people report. But again, I'm pretty OCD when it comes to health, and so I do realize that it is. I don't actually know anybody who's taken it who's told me like personally that they've had any problems. So it is something that I am considering and would consider. But there was I don't know if he was a nephrologist or a urologist on Peter Tia's podcast who said he would never recommend anybody taking it. And, generally Peter Tia has pretty good guests who, are established. But I agree that if you actually look at the research, most people are completely fine with it.
Well, you have to remember the clinician experience too. They are going to be dealing with people who are experiencing side effects because they're coming to them.
Sure.
And you also have to think about the anecdotal experience when you talk to people. The people who you talk to aren't having side effects, right? Someone who did probably goes off it. And another thing to consider is most of the studies, when you look at the side effects, they're taking um, like 5 milligrams daily or 1 milligram daily a lot of the times. So I'm not aware of any long-term research on taking 1 milligram like every other day or something
Yeah,
like
I'm not
that.
either.
So I am taking a very, very low dose, and I think, yeah, like the impact on my hormonal profile and the impact on my life and the experience side effects have been none, like quite literally.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know my DHT's gone down, right? Or I wouldn't have my hair, but I haven't actually had my DHT measured, but my
Oh,
testosterone
really?
levels haven't changed outside of the normal when I've gotten them measured in similar states of energy availability. My experience hasn't changed
I mean, in
in terms
theory,
of
your
my
total
life.
testosterone could go up a little bit, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
And as far as the potential anabolic benefits or downsides to that, we're weighing up is
Yeah, I mean, I don't.
DHT versus testosterone, and then it's also like how much of that is free, and then how much is that it's going to get used. But yeah, like if you look at the research on this, on changes in body composition in men taking finasteride, there's generally like no effect. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, trust me, like if I had I would have traded my hair for bigger muscles. So I don't think um that sounds like I'm just willing to go on steroids within the confines of being a natural bodybuilder, to be clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like but yeah, from like if you look at the data, there's no there's no data or mechanistic rationale, in my opinion, with the type of dosages that are used to prevent hair loss where I would suspect there'd be any negative effect on body composition.
Yeah, and
And I
that's the
haven't
thing. I mean,
experienced it.
right. Because not only do I obviously, highly respect your opinion scientifically, but I also know how dedicated you are to bodybuilding. And so I think of all people, you would be somebody who, like, if the concerns were happening, you just wouldn't do it. So that's why I wanted to ask.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it wasn't a decision that I made lightly, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Steve, just curious, any thoughts? I know last time we had,
Yeah, it's
discussed it.
funny
Yeah.
because I literally got my hair cut today and I talked to my hairdresser about the fact that I wasn't willing to go on finasteride or try the
Okay.
midoxanil. I was actually going to
Wow.
ask Eric why and maybe not try midoxanil. I don't know if you just find that one seems to be more of a nuisance because you have to do stuff a lot of
Yeah.
the time.
It didn't work.
Oh, it didn't
Um,
work.
yeah, and if you look at the data on it, it tends to be more effective for not the typical male pattern balding of or they're both typical actually. It's more effective for developing a bald spot in the back than
Uh,
it is for receding hairline. Um, and yeah, but I did try it.
yeah, I've
I did
spoken
I did them
to
both in concert for a while, and then I just dropped off on the
Yeah.
the minoxidil.
So I have, I mean, Eric maybe has sold me on trying it actually. I don't know if I want to try it during prep just
Certainly
because I
not
don't
my
know.
attempt. Yeah,
But
that's
I've got the
So as a
same
doctor, you would
balding
prescribe it, Eric, is
pattern.
what you're saying.
yeah.
Uh,
As a PhD in RPE, I would say
I
I
have
have
people
no.
ask me in DMs if I can prescribe testosterone. And you're like, mm,
You're
no.
like, technically, I can, and let's make some money here.
I mean,
But
if I could come up with some oral benefits to justify it, then sure.
there you go.
Sorry,
but
Steve, go ahead.
I spoke to Martin McDonald again to bring him up, and obviously he has a shaved head, and he has a whole. I think he actually ended up doing a whole podcast. Like he has a podcast on his podcast. He did an episode about his hair loss and because he had bad effects from finasteride. So yeah, he was just kind of
Oh,
walking through
really?
that journey of yeah, because he, I guess for guys, it's like, I don't know, it can be a big deal when you eventually have to decide to shave your hair off. Like
Yeah.
I've also considered like getting a hair transplant, but I'm like, I don't have to take long-term finasteride and medoxinil.
Hmm.
Yeah, right. You'll
But
still lose the hair that you would have lost, right? So then it's just kind of
yeah,
different. So he
so
said he came off he had tried finasteride and came off because of the side effects.
yeah, he got his like libido and stuff, like the sexual function and things, I think was not great from memory. But it's
Interesting.
a while ago since I spoke to him about it.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. So, all right, guys. Well, to wrap up, you guys have both got very exciting progress in different directions going on here. So, Steve, you are competing to 12 weeks. First time working with Cliff Wilson, right?
Yep.
And you have, other than what we talked about, like anything that you're noticing is like very different with this prep or any expectations that you have going into it that you're going to prepare for differently?
So one thing working with Cliff and having a coach is more valuable than I could have imagined because we just have that one contact email a week, but just knowing someone's there taking care of my timeline and making any adjustments who I trust to get me ready on time has just been invaluable. That I think as a coach and when you're well educated, like Eric is as well, you can do it yourself. You can take yourself to stage, but she just outsourcing it so you can focus on the rest of life has just been such a stress relief for me. So that's been one huge win. And then also, I think last time at this point, I was wearing, I think, a 10-kilo vest and standing most
Oh,
of the day
Oh,
and
yeah.
wearing it for all my steps. And my step count was 15,000 plus. Whereas this time around, no weighted vest,
Mm,
just my usual step count, not having to push that. And I think that's not because like I've suddenly grown loads of muscle and my metabolism's like changed or something, but I can afford to go slower because I've been ready even earlier. So we can really go stepwise down. Even last time I took quite a lot of time, but this time even more so. So it's been like I don't my personal experience with the weighted vest wasn't amazing, and I certainly wouldn't advise wearing it like the whole day. Maybe wearing it for some walks if you need some extra expenditure. I could see that being a good win, but the whole I forgot what was called the rationale where it could help maintain muscle mass a bit better and maintain metabolic rate and things. It didn't really work out for me so well. So that's been
mm,
something nice because it's been just way less stressful having to manage that. So yeah, I have the first show that's definitely in my diary is the WMBF UK, which is in 12 weeks. I might do the Netherlands, maybe Ireland WMBF shows potentially if Cliff says that like we're in making good time and maybe I can use those as like a bit of brush off the cobwebs. Because yeah, if I can do something similar to Eric this year, I would absolutely love that. But I'll just go out there and
let's
be my
go.
best. It was definitely inspiring seeing you get that pro card, Eric. It was awesome.
Thanks, brother. And I think you've got a really good shot. You've been making really awesome improvements, man. So I'll be pulling for you. And I would say just keep doing shows because that's all I had to do. I just had to compete 5 times, and we're good to go.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's awesome, man. I forgot about all the like the weighted vest stuff. I know Eric Lee Salazar, he was like talk about how amazing it was for him and it was like a total game changer. I've never done it. I mean, I've done rucking just as like a cardio method, but not nothing all day at all.
Yeah, it was all the gravitostat and the kind of weighing on the bones for the osteocytes being like a regulator of hunger and things. And yeah, it didn't pan out for me.
Mm.
And I haven't seen it be a game changer for anyone I've really spoken to, apart from Eric. Eric seems to absolutely love it. Like I've
Yeah,
seen Eric
yeah.
Salazar doing it every prep. So like clearly it's working for him.
Yeah, right. How about you, Eric? What's going on?
yeah, man. I mean, the big thing for me, I've got probably another. depending upon what I'm looking like, we've had to adjust this plan multiple times. The original plan was to get to 88 kilos and then do a mini cut and get to 88 by November. And here I am at 89, 90. It's July, and I'm leaner than I anticipated I would be at 88. So we've kind of gone, all right, let's get up to 92, and then see what we're looking like then. Do a mini cut, eat back up, and then probably start dieting for 2025 sometime in March or April, with plans to compete in the latter 3 months of the year, basically. So like maybe as early as September, but probably no earlier than that, 2025. And right now I'm just trying to do as much as I possibly can to make progress, and really enjoying it. So yeah.
Yeah, that's exciting, man. I mean, to have been doing this for so long, still have the passion, but not like an arbitrary passion that is stemming from seeing fantastic progress. That's really awesome.
Well, there was actually one point, and I'll try to be brief with this, which
Yeah.
is going to fail as soon as I say it, but at least I'm trying. Um, Earlier we talked about how we're kind of juxtaposing like, oh, Eric's making these gains, but maybe it's because he used to always train for strength and hypertrophy simultaneously, and maybe that wouldn't be possible if he hadn't. I think that to some degree is true, but I think at the same time there's also this false comparison to people who have trained for hypertrophy their whole training career, the assumption that because that's their intention, they're doing it optimally and they've gotten the most out of it.
Mm,
Like Steve was mentioning, oh, I used to power build. And I remember not too long ago in 2013, like almost all very serious bodybuilders I knew, they were like, well, I have to do DUP and I
right,
have to
right.
do squat, bench, and deadlift. And they were probably doing a more powerlifting specific program in 2013 than even I was doing competing in powerlifting. Um, and then when you just see the crazy crap that bodybuilders do that they believe is optimal, so at least they've got the placebo effect or expectation on their side.
Yeah.
I think it's very rarely true that even when you are intending to just train for one outcome for the entirety of your training career, that it actually is optimal. And one thing that I always like to remind people is that if you took a competitive bodybuilder for 10 years training, who's competing every year, other year, and a non-competitive bodybuilder, the non-competitor might be getting bigger because they're not starving themselves until they look like they belong in a concentration camp where they happen to have a weight room, every other year. So it's kind of this thing where we're often comparing it to a hypothetical optimal, but at best, what you have done is what the current data could suggest was optimal at that time. So like I look back on my training career, even as someone who was always a hybrid athlete, and there were very few times where I don't think I was making training decisions in a programming perspective that were better than the average person who might have been training purely for strength or hypertrophy. That may sound arrogant, but I mean, I've bent my entire mindset and my will to that goal. And there were compromises because I was training for both. But like, there's a period where I was training for Olympic lifting where like I wasn't doing calf raises at all. Like, sure, those times existed. Um, but they were relatively few and far between. And I think even if I had been training purely for bodybuilding, I don't know if it would have been that much better. It would have been
Mm,
better, but it wouldn't have been like that much better, I think, which is just something to remember that it's hypothetically optimal is just that, hypothetical.
true, true, true. Well, guys, thank you again. Always love talking to you guys. Whenever I have either if I can't take on a client or if somebody wants to, do a competition, I don't take people to stage. And so you guys are basically the first names I always refer people to. You guys are
Appreciate
great.
that.
So thank you guys for taking the time today.
Thanks for
Thank you
having
so much
us.
for having me.